Okay, hi. So now we're going to talk about some of the details about the church in the conquest that I introduced through discussing themes and frameworks. So hold on, buckle your seatbelt. We're going to get into some details around this, and some of this I will be talking about in class as well. So I've titled this lecture, Creating Colonial Cosmologies, Missionaries, and Religious Institutions. So today, we're talking about the church's explicitly religious activities, the church as institution, attempting to bring about religious change in the 16th century. But I want you to remember and understand that this is not just what we think of as religious change, meaning internal beliefs or structures around ritual, etc. But it is the role of the church in establishing empire, fundamentally political change, also what is also um, ultimately economic organization as well. So we're going to be talking about some of the church activities and institutions, but for this time period, and this is true up until at least the middle of the 18th century, we're also looking at these church institutions in their function as largely judicial institutions, largely courts, and the ways that they interfaced with uh, indigenous people as authority figures, not simply teachers of spiritual expertise, etc. So, um, and also, as I say that, this is church as institution, it's essential to keep in mind that Catholicism was not a monolith and that the church was not simply one monolithic institution. There were competing authorities and, oh, oops, well, that's no good. I apologize for that, but I don't think I'm gonna stop. Um, Even though that's awkward. I turned off my monitor for a second, but I don't want to take the time to re-record what I just said, so I apologize. Um, but what I was trying to say is, there are competing authorities within this thing that we call church and all kinds of different organizations and institutions and practices. Um, but for today, the most important distinction of this early period is the one that I want to talk to you about first, and that is the distinction between regular and secular clergy. Okay. So, first of all, the secular branch of the church doesn't mean secular in a non-religious sense. It comes from the Latin word seculum, meaning in the world. And this is what we call the diocesan clergy. These are priests who operate under the authority of the bishop. These priests are pastors of one kind or another, and they're part of the broad bureaucracy of the church. They're organized into parishes and then into a diocese, which is a kind of political organization of smaller areas, parishes. So you could think of parishes as little towns, or even neighborhoods, and then a diocese as maybe a county, if you want to compare it to political organization or municipal organization that you're familiar with. But so uh, th this part of the church bureaucracy is organized into parishes and then dioceses, and then and the dioceses are under bishops, and then these dioceses are combined together to underneath the authority of cardinals, and ultimately under the authority of the Pope in Rome. You don't need to remember all of this, but that's the structure. And the reason why it's important is because do you remember the patronato, one of the powers that the Pope gave the Spanish king and queen, Isabel and Ferdinand, but therefore the Spanish crown in perpetuity? The Pope had given the king and queen of Spain the right to appoint all secular or diocesan clergy. So generally, this actually in practice meant that they just appointed the bishops who were in charge of the diocese. But then the bishops were in charge of all of the priests. And the bishops in colonial Latin America had real authority, and their authority had real teeth. They acted as judges, they presided over courts, and actually every priest could also reside over its own little parish level court if the bishop gave that priest the authority to do so. So the diocesan branch of the church, in other words, was intimately related to state government. Regular clergy were the religious orders, and the word regular doesn't mean ordinary. It comes from the Latin word regula, or rule or law, and it means identifies a group of religious or a religious order that follows a particular law, a particular regula. So it identifies, in other words, groups of clergy who lived by a special set of laws. The religious orders were not appointed by the king, and they answered only to their superiors, which might be at a particular monastery, and also ultimately the superior for the whole religious order that was back in Rome. So bishops were still considered important religious authorities of whatever region the religious orders happened to be in, but there was a tension always between the regular and the secular clergy because religious orders didn't answer to the bishop in the same direct way that diocesan priests do. Um, so this becomes important because in Spain, religious orders were not priests. They were not pastors. They did not operate in that way. That's the difference between secular, meaning in the world, having these kinds of roles in people's lives and in authority in relationship to their rules to their roles as judges. Whereas the regular clergy followed particular rules, and I'm going to talk more about the distinction between different religious orders in a moment. But they, within this role as usually monks and friars, one of the powers that they had that they did not have was to act as a pastor. They did not run parishes in Europe. Now, this changes in the 16th century, in the earliest moment of the conquest, and the Pope gives, and the king gives religious orders and particular religious orders the power to be in charge of the conversion and the setting up of parishes of indigenous people. And this is extremely significant. And we spoke a little bit about this before, but back to the details here. So there were different kinds of regular priests, different kinds of religious orders. They, again, weren't really priests previously, but in the context of the 16th century Latin America, they were priests. So I'm going to continue to call them priests in this instance. But one kind that was very important in the 16th century were the mendicant orders. So the most well known of these mendicant orders are the Franciscans, Carmelites, Dominicans, and Augustinians. But the important thing is that this type of religious order, a mendicant order, uh, it, take took vows of poverty. So a mendicant means beggar, means someone who requests, who lives off of the charity of people through the act of, asking for it. It's a particular kind of humility and a particular kind of lifestyle that had religious meaning. So all of the mendicant orders took vows of poverty. Sometimes mendicants would be cloistered. Sometimes the requests for support came in the form of requesting that people support the whole monastery. Sometimes they individually wandered the streets praying and literally begging for their food. They would not be pastors normally in Europe at the, prior to the 16th century, and they didn't have the ability to say mass or perform the rituals known as sacraments. This was the purview of diocesan clergymen normally. Normally, also in the past, mendicant orders were not involved with education. Some religious orders were, but not mendicants. They were intended to be separate from the world and live holy lives, uninterested in worldly affairs, dedicated to prayer and meditation. They were a kind of spiritual athlete of the world. They were thought of as less vulnerable to the corruption that may be a challenge and a danger for diocesan clergy who were in the world and who had intimate relationship to political authority. So these cloistered people had held a kind of mystique in the larger society of the Iberian Peninsula, and increasingly so in Latin America as well. We'll talk about nuns and convents in a future date, and how important they were, but there was a real belief that the prayers of all of these people who lived behind the walls of cloisters or were hermits or otherwise devoted themselves completely to the practice of spirituality were powerful, and that they were performing a genuine and very important, materially felt service to society. And so society was willing to support them with alms and donations, etc. There were other types of religious orders that could serve in the world and could be pastors in limited capacity, and these were clerical religious orders. The Jesuits were among these, and the Jesuits were a teaching order. Teaching orders were orders that took education as a primary task. The Jesuits were not very present in the 16th century in Latin America, but they would become important missionaries later in the frontier regions where the missions were still needed. Jesuits did become important in the 17th century. In Latin America, uh, but uh, but they were not the front runners for most of mainland Latin America. However, they were actually important in the early years of Brazil, and so that's an important distinction. But so when Spain, stumbled into the Americas, the Pope decided that only the kind of purest of the pure, what he called spiritual athletes, should be put in charge of evangelizing the New World. And so the Pope gave the mendicant religions, those religious orders that lived separate from the world and had taken a vow of poverty, the job and the ability to teach native people about Christianity. So, in a series of papal bulls, the Pope granted all types of religious orders to temporary, it was thought, but it didn't become temporary, license to act as pastors and administer sacraments, including the mendicant orders. And this meant that they could live among people and act like parish priests. Up until this point, as I said before, this was unusual. It was a special extension from the Pope for Latin America that would actually never be fully withdrawn. In 1568, it was restricted in significant ways that returned much of the power to diocesan clergy, but not all of it. And this would shape the character of the Catholic Church in Latin America throughout the colonial period. Um, that restriction was known as the secularization of the church. And this was always the intention of the Spanish king. The Spanish king, gave the power to these religious orders with permission from the Pope at the request of the Pope. It was really kind of a partnership, how that happened, that the religious orders would take, and particularly the mendicants, would take primary charge of converting, of spreading Christianity to indigenous people. And therefore, that meant that they would organize indigenous people into parishes. But the plan was that after the initial conversion was done, then these parishes would return to, or, would be handed over to the power of diocesan clergy, to the power of priests who were appropriately under the authority of the bishop, who was under the authority of the Spanish king. This was supposed to start happening quickly. There was an order in 1568 that asked that, officially made this secularization process begin. But in reality, it happened locally in a very varied way, such that in some parts of Latin America, there are certain places and parishes that were never secularized. And in other instances, it took 50 more years, 100 more years. And this was one of those obedezco pero no cumplo kind of examples of that idea of, I obey, but I do not comply. Local authorities saying, this isn't going to work. You're saying that you want to return or pass over or hand off the authority, uh, of ministering and being the pastor and running the parishes of these indigenous people to diocesan clergy, but all the diocesan clergy live in the cities. None of them speak indigenous languages. No one wants to live here. So the reality of it is, it's just not going to work. In other instances, it did officially happen, but there were no priests really to serve in these indigenous communities. And so often the indigenous churches were actually kind of run by indigenous people themselves. And there was a traveling priest that would be sent from the cities. Often they were actually religious order priests, but sometimes not, who would come once a year to administer the necessary sacrament of sorry, my computer's about to die. I just realized I need to recharge it. Of confession and communion, etc. But sometimes, in fact, the indigenous people would have to travel to receive those sacraments. So that's not in my notes, but that is a part of the future story. So um, and I will talk later in another lecture about what happened after 1568 when these diocesan priests do become important. And part of that I will be talking about is what I just mentioned. But from 1492 to 1568, the mendicants really were officially in charge. So a special kind of Catholicism was introduced at this time at their hands. And some of that is what you're reading about in Jennifer Shepherd Hughes' book, because it was these particular kind of clergymen who were encountering the epidemics and the massive loss of life of indigenous people. So we'll talk about that in our smaller groups. So this had an especially strong impact in Mexico because the Spanish presence was established by 1521. So this means that the presence of mendicant orders, particularly Franciscans, shaped the native experience of Christianity for almost 50 years. And this is part of what Jennifer Shepherd Hughes is talking about. However, the Spaniards didn't really establish themselves in Peru, for instance, until the late 1540s. So the period of the mendicants being the main pastors in Peru is much shorter. Mendicants didn't disappear after 1568, but they didn't have all that much authority in Peru to assert their ability to stay involved because they'd only been around for 20 years. This is different in Mexico. So it's important to think about when you read about, say, Jose de Acosta in Peru, who was a Jesuit, not a mendicant, but not a diocesan priest either. What kind of position might that have given him as an observer to this whole process? In a letter that you may have read, hopefully by Pedro de Gante, you can see a good representation of the ways that Franciscans often thought of themselves and talked about themselves. They described themselves as humble servants and teachers to a native population. They articulate a model of tender love and fierce protectors. Remember that they've taken a vow of poverty. They've been commanded to take up the work of evangelization and self-sacrifice in a passionate kind of way. Do you remember the document that you read called The Orders to the 12, in which the Franciscan leader in Spain was calling the first 12 Franciscans, visualized as the first 12 disciples of Christ, to obediency and to a kind of urgency? The leader says, hurry down now to the active life. Um, this is a cushy post. This is not a cushy post. You have a job to do. You've taken a vow of poverty and obedience. Now get on with it. That kind of thing. Like basically saying, you've been steep and trained through your generations of, this kind of envisioned as sort of spiritual generations of secluded, the word I'm looking for is escaping me right now, contemplation and practice. Now bring that knowledge, bring that power, bring that strength into the world, because we are in urgent times and we've just encountered this whole huge part of the world that somehow has not heard this message of Christianity, and the end times are upon us, and the empire rides on this duty of yours. Now get down into the world and take up the action of active clergymen, of parish leaders. So the first generation of these friars were dedicated and committed to this mission. They were not bureaucrats. Um, they saw themselves as operating apart from the rest of the colonial enterprise. They were, in fact, often in conflict with encomenderos, like the Dominicans were in the Caribbean, and they came from the same tradition of mendicant friars, of contemplation, of being separate from the world. This first generation of friars were often also in great conflict with state government authorities once they started to get set up in Mexico and elsewhere. Many Franciscans held vividly millenarian views of the human horizon, of human history, and an apocalyptic vision of the immediate future. These ideas were based on the book of Revelation in the New Testimony, and in their sermons and lessons, they referred to Revelations over and over. They expected the day of judgment to come in their own time. The end of the world was coming, and they would be around for it. In this mission that they were undertaking was crucial from their perspective because the more souls they could bring in and baptize, the more people they could save in the final hour of judgment. A Franciscan report in 1550 said that in 30 years they had baptized 7 million people, smashed 160,000 idols, and constructed over 1,000 parishes. These are amazing numbers, especially with a relatively small number of people doing this work. This is a flurry of evangelizing activity, changing the look of the landscape, putting churches everywhere with church bells that rang every hour, so changing the auditory landscape of the world too. This was a very real and dramatic change in the areas that Spaniards had settled. One of the religious chroniclers, looking at all of this church activity, wrote in the 1550s, "The whole land is as Catholic as ours," referring to Spain. But this view is dependent on a certain superficial vision of what it meant to be Catholic. I would say that it was indeed very Catholic in the sense that most people in the central areas of Mexico already defined themselves as Catholic, but that this identity had become important to them in the course of one generation. Um, uh, I mean, this is true, I would argue. But to say that it was as Catholic as Spain is to suggest that it was Catholic in the same way as Spain, and this misses some very important differences. Um, it has to do with debates about the nature of belief and faith itself. Franciscans and other churchmen wondered, did belief and faith really require what we might call a complete conversion, a complete change of heart? Or did it simply require incorporation, as in incorporation into the church physically? Um, the community of faith that was defined by baptism, going to mass, receiving the sacrament, saying the right words in prayer, even if you didn't understand those words. This was a real question, a real theological and philosophical debate that was alive for people in Europe as much as it was in Latin America. We might look at this in our generally modern and Protestant inflected world that we live in now and think, and we can talk about why I say it's a Protestant inflected world, even if it is populated by Catholics as well as Protestants, but the impact of these ideas after the Protestant Reformation had taken place for, a couple centuries, was strong in the Catholic Church as well. And you can see that in post-Vatican II, but that's another history. But at this time, though, that was a startling sound coming from my phone. Um, but at this time, so anyways, if from the perspective of our kind of modern world, we might look at this and say that's just superficial, like it's not real. People aren't really believing these things. It's just performance. But that misunderstands the way that people thought about what you might call religious efficacy, what people thought about what we now call religion actually meant. In some ways, it helps us to understand it if we think about magic. If we think about the way that we now in the modern world might, and scholars of religion have, defined the difference between magic and religion according to some cosmologies and some ways of knowing, some epistemologies, is that certain actions, certain practices, certain rituals, when done by the right people under the right circumstances, have a power of their own that is not necessarily related to one's thought process or one's internal belief. And there was a way in which that's how religion was understood, or at least it was a debate at this time. And so, uh, you know, from the perspective of many, many religious thinkers in the 16th century, the fact that, from the perspective that values incorporation, meaning baptism, belonging to, getting a new name, a new Christian name, belonging to a parish, following these particular rituals in a particular order, that from that perspective, that incorporation was more important than a complete change of heart or comprehension. Even also, this perspective held that most common people couldn't even ever really understand, the complexity of true religious ideas, which were thought of as deeply sophisticated and as hard to understand as any kind of elite philosophy. Remember that at this time, Mass was said in Latin. So no one really understood um, all of it except for those people who spoke Latin, the educated few. So it was understood that, common people needed visual references, they needed simplified stories. And more important than any of those things really was the kind of physical incorporation into the body of the church. So in this way, it's also like belonging to a parish is much like the concept of citizenship or subjecthood. You are a subject of the Spanish crown. You are a parishioner. You are a member of the church by sheer fact of the rituals and the change of official identity that incorporates you into either the Spanish Empire or the Christian church. So, from this perspective, it may have been that, at least in the Valley of Mexico, to say it was truly Catholic was sincere, was a sincere belief, and was in some senses true. However, this did fall short of the glorious dream that most Franciscans had carried with them in the very first decades. The idea that that this really would be a kind of true Christian land in which the way that people imbibed and believed in the vision of Christ looked like the earliest church, looked like the earliest Christians. And this mapped onto the idea of Spain being at the helm of a Holy Roman Empire that was to be infused with this pure spirit of the early church. So that did not happen from the perspective of the Franciscans who were there. And by the late 16th century, the realization that they had not succeeded to bring this vision about and achieving this kind of paradise on earth that they had envisioned and hoped to create was a painful conclusion for these Franciscans. Martin de Valencia, who's one of the most prominent of the Franciscans in Spanish America, wrote in the 1570s about a dream that he had had that comes close to describing how the friars thought about evangelization by that time, by the late 16th century. So the dream was about two women, one disfigured and one beautiful, both with a baby in their arms, trying to cross this rapid river. The disfigured woman could only cross with great difficulty. The beautiful mother did so easily. Valencia understood that the disfigured mother and baby was the church, represented the church of New Spain, the church of the area that is now Mexico and Central America and the Caribbean. The beautiful pair represented another new land yet to be discovered, where this evangelization and conversion would be easier and more complete. So in this moment, Martin de Valencia is someone who was still holding on to this utopian vision, but having personally spent his whole adult life in the effort of trying to bring it about, he was prepared to say that it had failed. He was saying that they had created something disfigured, in fact, It crosses the river okay, so it's nominally Catholic, nominally Christian. It's not a complete waste, but that great dream, the initial dream of utopia, had fallen by the wayside for Latin America. Franciscans and missionaries grew increasingly pragmatic over the course of the 16th century as they actually encountered the real difficulties of evangelization. An early Franciscan wrote, if you wait to, quote, if you wait to baptize the perfect, you will never baptize anyone. The point was to bring in the willing as soon as possible, and then realize that it might take generations before these willing natives grew to truly understand Christianity. So it's not surprising that the early years produced this kind of pragmatism also because everyone was limited until the missionaries learned to speak and write in indigenous languages. The early techniques for religious instruction were things like pantomimes and songs and plays. These performances had an impact. They were enjoyed and picked up and performed by Native communities, and many of them are still performed today in really interesting ways in religious and local festivals. But whether they got across the message the priest intended is another story. Um, and this is even more true with some of the bizarre methods of pantomime that some priests resorted to. One rather disturbing example that illustrates this dramatically is from a priest who described the method he used to teach indigenous people, whose language he did not yet speak, about the reality of hell. He dug a big hole and threw in all kinds of cats and dogs and set them on fire so that they would wail and illustrate the pain and suffering of hell. We can only imagine what indigenous onlookers might have interpreted this bizarre, you know, brutal behavior as meaning. But soon, very soon, actually, these friars began to study indigenous languages, and this allowed for a more direct kind of teaching. However, to really fully gain a grasp on the language took time, and so even with Nahuatl words, they still focused at first on the superficial elements of Christianity. Early teaching techniques were more about actions associated with Catholicism rather than the beliefs behind them, in other words. And as I said before, this was not just cynicism, it was consistent with beliefs in Catholicism at the time that God appreciated action, that the prayers and words of the sacraments themselves had meaning, even if the people didn't understand them. Remember, as I mentioned before, that the Mass was said in Latin and that the prayers were said in Latin. So many Spanish people didn't understand fully what they were saying or listening to either, though they had been taught the basic prayers and what they meant in religious education to the extent that they had access to them. Um, the example that I'm going to give a couple more examples and then I'm going to stop and I'm going to break this into a second video. But one of the examples is one that a scholar named Inga Clendenin cites in her work, where Franciscans are teaching Native people prayers in Nahuatl that sounded like words in Latin. So they're being encouraged to recite the sounds of the prayers, even though the actual words in Nahuatl didn't mean what the prayer in Latin meant. So this belief was that the sounds of Latin saying the prayers would be pleasing to God. But what did the Nahuatl speaking people think they were actually saying? So put together the words for nopal, cactus, and flag was Pantli Nochli. And this sounded like Pater Noster. I'm not saying any of this correctly, probably, which was God our Father in Latin. So in terms of meaning, nopal, cactus, flag was just nonsense to the indigenous people reciting them. This disconnect was bridged over time as more and more priests learned indigenous languages and became completely fluent in them. But even then, relying on indigenous languages to explain Christianity meant relying on indigenous concepts that were embedded in the language to describe Christianity. And this, of course, changed the meaning. There was no word for hell. The underworld and places like it were not the same thing as the Christian hell. There was no word for devil. Words for evil and good and the relationship between them were not at all the same. There was no real word for complete good and complete evil. There were words for order and chaos um, and excess and again, kind of order and restraint, which were good and bad depending on the context. Even the word for God was not even really the same concept. So this contributed to native acceptance of Christianity on the one hand and interest in it because the Spaniards were using concepts that weren't so foreign to them. But it also contributed to native interpretations of it, which were very different than what the Spaniards were hoping to entail. So the story of the countryside and indigenous communities for the first half of the 16th century is the story of religious orders setting up parishes, of missionary communities evangelizing and teaching, but also trying to set themselves and the native people they saw as protecting apart from the rest of the colonial order. These religious orders saw themselves as being in a special relationship to native people, and this would last throughout the colonial period, even when that period of official power was over and secularization happened. Okay, so I'm going to end here, and then in the next lecture, I'm going to talk about aspects of the church in the 16th century that would have impact not only indigenous people, but the growing Spanish and mixed race society, and then do some reflections on the patterns of religious change over the course of this century. All right, thank you all. See you soon.